So let me just make sure. Okay, I clicked the record button to capture this. For those of you who may be watching or still in the process of joining, Gary just asked a great question about applying the Jewish American or American Jew question to Israelis or to Israel. And so I'm going to answer in three parts. One is, it's a great question. Two, as I hope I said when I covered it about America, it's a false choice. And we're going to kind of investigate some of that next week when we do dual loyalties, that it falsely makes it such that you have to preference one over the other, particularly if you're hyphenating. So there's been a move to get away from the hyphen, because like Italian Americans or African Americans, right, versus like Italian Catholics, or right, we don't. It's a different question. So the third answer is actually kind of along the lines of what you were saying, and is where part of last week's multiple units tried to encompass something. So it's a little bit of a reminder to those who are part of the conversation. One of the people who gets interviewed in the videos is an Israeli Arab. So I want to be careful here. Typically, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship do not call themselves Palestinian. They'll call themselves Israeli Arabs. And it's an important distinction. I'm sure there are many who retain their Palestinian identity, but they're making a conscious choice to be part of Israel, and to accept their citizenship as an open door, right, to being part of something larger. And one of the things that that individual said is that he hopes that Zionism can mature into, instead of Jewish nationalism, into Israeli nationalism. And in the same way that America and its nationalism encompasses, e pluribus unum, which at one point meant different political ideologies, and maybe different religious ideologies, maybe it could also encompass different racial identities or ethnic identities, right? So all kinds of, like, we could be a majority minority country with not any one particular minority being the largest. Maybe Israel can do the same. And so that the Jewish people and Jewish nationalism will be a part of Israeli nationalism, but not the whole. And that would make room for Israeli Arabs to be to be nationalist on behalf of Israel. Again, open question, right? But it is important to note that there are Israeli Arabs, citizens of the state of Israel, who very much want that to be the case. So, and now that our group is a little bit larger, I will welcome everyone. Here we are in our Together Apart series. This is session 5, to help us kind of like, acquaint ourselves with the material and with each other. I pose this question for you to think about. Which nationalism is harder for you to articulate? American nationalism and then Jewish or Israeli nationalism, which could be the same thing or different things, as we were just noting. So anyone want to kind of say something about this question?
I would say that the thing that makes it hard for me is that the question implies your religion. If I think about Israeli nationalism, whereas if I think about American nationalism, even though people have talked about this being a Christian country to a great extent, and it is, but I think for most of us, we're secular. And religion doesn't enter into the concept of nationalism. It makes it easier for me.
That makes a lot of sense. I heard other voices, so.
I actually
I have
find
a,
here, I find it easier to articulate my Jewish identity, but as you know, if you wanted to say Jewish nationalism in terms of peoplehood,
Yes.
and being a part of a larger group and being proud to be Jewish, it's easier for me to talk about that than either of the other two, mostly because, you know, I'm not a part of Israel, like I don't live there. So I feel like I can't define that nationalism, but given everything that's gone on the last several years in America, it's very hard for me to be a proud American or to articulate that American nationalism is good, because it's been so very close to that bad sort of nationalism that, you know, I'm sitting here going, you know, that's hard for me right now. Right now, I can talk about my Jewish identity the easiest.
I get that, Mary. Thank you for sharing. Somebody else was also trying to share.
My dad.
well, I look at it, we've got an adjective and we've got a noun. I'm an American, I'm a Jewish American. To say that I'm American Jew means that my national identity, now it comes to Israel, I would think the same. You can be an Arab Israeli or a Jewish Israeli or Christian Israeli.
Correct.
If you're Israeli. Now, the dilemma I have, of course, is I'm an American Jew. So, I'm a Jewish American. So, by not based on a noun, I'm not an Israeli.
Right.
So I haven't yet, in answer to your question, I'm not sure that I can really define my relationship with Israel because I'm not an Israeli. I'm an American.
Fair. And I look, I'll be honest. The question in many ways is designed less to provoke answers than to provoke more questions. So you could have thought about articulating Israeli nationalism, not for yourself, not your own attachment to Israel, but like, what is the Israel project, right? Most people today, the language, the Hasbara, is about the startup nation, right? And the rate of vaccination in the country, and far less about the security situation. So you could put yourself in the mindset, or as a scholar, so to speak, of Israeli nationalism, right? But when we talk about our own identities, absolutely, there's this tough question about, is it religious? Is it ethnic? Is it geographic? Like, I'm an American, right? And the other pieces come in and out. And maybe, like Mary, it changes over the course of time and in terms of context. Anyone else want to share before we dig into today?
Yes.
Go ahead, Seth.
Israel is a Jewish state. That's how it was envisioned. That's what it is. People are welcome to be there, but it's a Jewish state. The United States is not a Christian state. It is a country for people of all, backgrounds and ethnicities. But Israel is a Jewish state. We have a little tiny sliver of the world. And, we bring so much to the world. But I don't think it's up for discussion. It's a Jewish state, period.
And in fact, to much of your point, the way the question was listed in the slide last week is it's a Jewish/Israeli, right? Because I wanted to leave open, right, that you could separate them, but really they're the same. That Jewish nationalism is currently, at least, right, about Israel. Before there was Israel, it was Zionism, and God willing, it'll always stay Israel. Lori, I saw your hand up.
What Seth articulated was what I was going to comment when you were talking about the Israeli Arab and how he wants to see Israel as this pluralistic, like America is as Seth says, blunts the fact that we do want a Jewish homeland, that we're always going to feel comfortable, or Jewish people are going to be always welcomed and be able to take other people. And if you go too far, you know, and this is the whole thing, if everyone has more babies than the Jewish population, could be overrun and no longer be that. And whether, you know, and whether that creates some other kind of minority, majority kind of thing is kind of scary when you try to go that way, that it won't keep the Judaism there.
Right. Good news, just for everyone's benefit. Population studies have proven that the Jews are good at keeping up. So at least with the Israeli Arab citizen group, right? So if we allowed for the, oftentimes in peace agreement conversations, there's a question of the right of return for Palestinians. So like if every Palestinian refugee descendant at this point were to become an Israeli citizen, yes, we would have a Jewish population problem, but Jews have kept pace and in fact have been having more children. And so the Jewish population continues to be on track to be the majority, whether through immigration, birth, and on all those things. But that was clearly not expected for, I think, 20 years prior to the last 5 years when that kind of information started to come out. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep our eye on it. Just means, you know, for now there's good news. Marla.
No, Ross won't let me continue to mute him, so I have to let him talk.
So Ross.
Yes, it's the end of the week. I'm allowed to speak once. You know, to that point, though, when you said about we're keeping up, it's really there with the ultra-Orthodox, which is kind of a mixed blessing. Israel, you know, they would. The other thing, as a Jew by choice, I have to say it's been a bit of a journey in me to understand the relationship between Judaism and the physical state of Israel. And I really took a long time for me to kind of get that. You know, it's not as, you know, growing up Christian, you know, it's like I'm a Christian. I'm American. I just happen to be Christian. But there's a difference if you understand what I'm trying to articulate. I don't know if I'm saying it very well. And to the third point you made about the fact, you know, Seth brought it up and so did Lori about, you know, about how does Israel be a true democracy if they're really a Jewish state? I mean, it's really kind of there's a conflict there. I mean, could an Arab Israeli become prime minister of Israel? I don't know. I'm not.
Yeah, so part of what last week's conversation was because there's no constitution to kind of make that question answered. The courts, the Supreme Court of Israel in particular, was kind of following the democracy side of the question, and a number of Jewish political parties set about defining a basic law, which is a sort of temporary constitutional document. It's like a law above it's sort of like our amendments to the Constitution, right? To make clear that it would have to be Jewish, right? And it doesn't say about the prime minister specifically, but the implication would be, I think, that that's not possible because you would have to have an Israeli Arab be the head of the largest political party to win votes in the Knesset. And I think by design, and also because the president of the country actually gets to choose which party actually kind of gets the chance to form the coalition, that would never happen. But again, the question is out there, and there are lots of ways to do democracy, not just the American model. And as maybe Mary was kind of bringing to light, sometimes it's possible that the American system isn't the best for democracy, right? Because democracy can be undermined. So I want to get into our class material for today because it's pretty engaging and pretty exciting. I don't know that it'll answer some of these questions, but I do think, to Ross's point about kind of like what it means to identify with a physical place, comes out a little bit in these texts, which is to say that when we think about anti-Semitism, there is a piece in the contemporary world where, regardless of what Judaism means to you, you are seen as an extension of Israel, right? From the outside. This is not necessarily what you think, but the expectation is put that way. And likewise, there's a certain degree to which, right, the Jewish story very much, going back to our very first class, is not about Israel. Pardon me. It's actually about what it's meant to be away from Israel and in exile and in diaspora. And not having a home or a place of security. So, you know, getting to have this conversation, we're very fortunate, right? 70 years, or you know, give or take, right? And we would not be having this conversation. So there's a degree to which this is something, when we talk about different kinds of nationalism, that really is representative of our unique experience in history, coupled with, right, all that came before. So a big part of tonight is going to be looking at sources just to make sure we kind of get the background. But I promise you, we'll also deal in the contemporary. So just an overview of tonight. We're going to look at definitions of anti-Semitism so that we're all talking about the same thing. And in the interest of time, I'm going to take questions, but not conversation about the definitions. Okay, so if it's not clear to you, by all means, interrupt me. If you have thoughts, you can put them in the chat, but I want to get past the definitions so that I can get to some of the sources, and then talk about different kinds of boundaries and how we might draw those boundaries, and the categories that it provides for us. For those of you who were in services Saturday when I gave the Devar Torah, you'll see how I got to some of my ideas once I define those categories, and I left them out of the Devar Torah, so you're going to get a little extra. And then we're going to get into today again, because I'm going to start off with some of it, okay? And look a little bit historically, a little bit more contemporarily about the right, left, and anti-Semitism is on both sides. Kind of see if we can say what to do about it, and set up any opportunities for continued learning, including enjoying Purim, I hope. So, are you ready? Here it is, syllabus, right? We have next week dual loyalties and identity. And then we're going to start doing new models for peoplehood, because right now we're in that, like, am I Jewish, am I American, am I American Jew, Jewish American, Israeli? We're all mixed up, but we're Jews. That's good. Okay, and we want to feel at home. So we'll get there in a few more weeks. Here is my, oh boy. President Trump is not an anti-Semite. He traffics with them. Representative Ilhan Omar is not an anti-Semite. She expresses anti-Semitic tropes. Mind you, the question mark is really important. Can we say this? Is this okay to say? Are we uncomfortable with this? Or, right, if we try to say this, why? Like, hello. There's a lot on the table. Okay, we're going to come back to this slide. I'm actually going to literally like show this slide again in the deck, so you can be like, wait, what was Jeremy getting at? So but that's tonight. like, this is what we're going to try to figure out. Can we say this or can we not? Right? So don't answer the question yet. Just like, can we do this? So what is anti-Semitism? There are going to be 4 definitions, right? And please make sure I'm clear and you're clear with me. Daniel Hartman wants to make sure we can all get on the same page about it. So he says a minimal definition is vilification of Jews qua Jews. If you are saying to me that I can't be who I am because I'm Jewish, we have a problem, right? If I am a college student running for student council and a group of other students say that I should not be allowed to run or I should fail in my campaign because of Israel, that's anti-Semitism, right? Because like, you didn't ask me about Israel. You just said I'm Jewish, so I must be, right, on a certain spectrum. You're not allowing me to be a Jew as a Jew. And there are so many other versions of this. Yossi Klein Halevi in the second of the 2 videos tells his life story, and he goes out of his way to have a red line definition. By red line, I mean like there's anti-Semitism, but then there's anti-Semitism. And he's concerned with anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism to him is lethal Jew hatred. So 2 quick things about that. Number 1, what is the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism? The difference for Yossi Klein Halevi is that, like, look, he was a journalist for most of his career, actually. But early on, he went to Chicago and was able, as a journalist, as a Jewish journalist, no less, to sit down at a table with the head of the American Nazi Party just before that group organized a march through Skokie, Illinois, filled with Holocaust survivors, because they wanted to say that the Holocaust wasn't real or Hitler didn't finish the job, all kinds of terrible, terrible anti-Semitic things. And Yossi Klein Halevi said, you know what that interview did for me? It pointed out that, like, a lot of anti-Semitism, it's just loser talk. That guy was a loser. He had no power. Yeah, he was gonna like do this terrible thing and it was hurtful. And Yossi Klein Halevi's parents are survivors, so like he was mortified, right? But he didn't feel that he was in danger. He could sit at the table and interview this guy and be like, "You're a schlub," right? And so for him, anti-Semitism that we had to worry about was anti-Semitism that was lethal Jew hatred, where his life or our lives are on the line. And the other thing I want to point out about this, and then Jerry, you can clarify. The other point I want to say about this is that there is a new-ish trend to distinguish between anti-Semitism, which is a little bit overused and technically actually includes our Arab cousins, if you think of Arabs that way, right? Because they're also Semitic. And it makes it clear that this is actually about us, about Jews, and it's hatred. It's not just like anti-whatever, it's Jew hatred. So there are those who are advocating, and I think Barry Weiss is the one who kind of kicked this off, to really say, like, let's stop using the word anti-Semitism, let's use Jew hatred. Jerry.
Thank you. Do you think that last definition meant lethal explicitly? Because if you take it on, if you read it on the surface, it means Jew hatred that breaks my arms and legs and puts me into a coma is perfectly fine. So I have trouble with that.
Yeah, so look, I'm not Yossi Klein Halevi. I can't answer the question 100% for you. I would say he's trying to draw the line somewhere between ending up in a coma and, you know, maybe getting some stitches, right? Which is still not so comfortable. But I do think that he means, like, yeah, the kind of stories that some of you may have actually lived, where, you know, you would walk to school and you would get beat up on the way. that was not for him lethal Jew hatred. That was goonish behavior, right? And I'm not saying that it's bad, not good, bad, right? That it's not anti-Semitic. I'm just saying, like, for Yossi Klein Halevi, that's not the issue, right? Because there's always going to be goons. The question is, right, what happens when those goons get guns, right? Or armies. And I would say this too, and I'm kind of reading into some of his more recent stuff, right? After the insurrection, not necessarily after Charlottesville, but after the insurrection, and certainly after Pittsburgh, he's started to feel like that's the real question, right? And we're going to get to that a little bit. So again, when these goons started to carry guns and to shoot us, that's when it was different. Clear on these two definitions? Again, a sort of minimalist and maximalist, like just vilifying and not letting a Jew be a Jew, like you're going to sort of get in our face and in our way, deny us the opportunity to live Jewishly, or you actually want to kill us. Then there's, and this is in the background reading for the second of the units that we're covering today, Natan Sharansky's 3D test. And I have to tell you, the 3D test has been the single most effective tool for students on college campuses. So for those of you with young adult children, share this slide with them when I distribute it, if you think they don't already know it. What do you do with someone, you can't figure out if they're being anti-Semitic or just maybe anti-Israel, or, they're just kind of in your face. So Natan Sharansky says there's this 3D test. The first D is demonization, right? And these are all about Israel, because Natan Sharansky is speaking as a member of the Israeli government at the time that he wrote this. When Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when Israelis are compared to Nazis, when the Israeli army is like the SS, right? These are blown out of all proportion. This was a big deal, particularly in the wake of the Second Intifada and the conflict with Gaza in, I want to say, 2007, where, right, people would talk about disproportionate warfare, that like, the Palestinians, or Hamas in particular, in Gaza, or Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, would shoot rockets, and then we would go in with like bombers, right? And some people would say that was disproportionate. That is demonizing Israel, because Israel's just defending itself. And to kind of get into that kind of comparison is not fair. And there are other ways that you could be anti-Semitic through unfairness, and that is double standards, which is to say, right, you're only going to hold Israel to this high moral standard, which, by the way, Israel wants for itself, because we want to be special and exceptional, but also a normal country. So it shouldn't be that 90% of UN resolutions that condemn a country for this or that, human rights violation are resolutions against Israel. It should be also against China with the Uyghurs, and it should be against, the Soviet Union, or sort of Russia, sorry, against, I'm forgetting the opposition leader's name, Alexei something, or again, going back to China, how it's dealing with Hong Kong and or Taiwan, right? So all these sort of questions, like, why is it only Israel being condemned? That double standard is a version of anti-Semitism, right? So if you want to critique Israel, fine, as long as you and I can also talk about human rights violations in other countries, right? Delegitimization, denying Israel's fundamental right to exist. So if what you're really saying is that Israel shouldn't be there at all, that's not a conversation. This is anti-Semitism, right? So if you're willing to say, yes, Israel has a right to exist, to defend itself, we can get into how is it handling the West Bank or Palestinian Authority or Palestinian people or, you know, Israeli Arabs. Like, we can have those conversations and we can talk about what's the best way to encourage Israel to solve problems on the ground, right? In ways that we might also appreciate from whatever moral standpoint, or you know, envisioning a world where colonialism is not something we have to worry about anymore. All kinds of sort of left-wing theories, but also sort of on the right, to sort of kind of like, how do we make this work? That's Sharansky's 3D test. Again, very useful, especially when confronting somebody who is trying to harm you by vilifying Israel along these 3 lines, right? And again, if they want to have a conversation, very different story.
I find it hard to identify with that because I keep putting Jewish where Israel shows up in the definition, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It works for Sharansky because he's an Israeli,
Yes.
but I'm not sure it works for me as a Jew living in America.
And it's not meant to. It's unless you are, for just lack of better context, a Jew on an American college campus, or another learning environment like one, a boarding school or whatever else.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand that.
Where you're not given that choice, right? You by being Jewish, you are in some ways representative of the state of Israel. So the next definition, Fred, is much more meant for all of us as opposed to Israel's Jews in Israel, or again, Jews who are being like seen as exemplars of Israel. So this definition is really important because it's become the basis for law. It was not designed to do that. It took 16 to 20 years to write. Lots of committee work, lots of like different efforts to kind of hit on this definition. It came in the wake of mostly attacks against Jews in France. And those attacks were from white supremacists or neo-Nazis and from Islamists who were like recent immigrants. And so you had the right and the left. and so the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA for short, tried to find a working definition so that law enforcement could learn to see certain kinds of incidents as anti-Semitic, as hate crimes, because otherwise it would just be like, a bunch of goons. And it's not, right? So I'll read you the definition. I'll kind of review that and sort of what's the purpose, and then I'm going to bring it into the very contemporary context in just a moment. So anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred of Jews. So again, you can perceive of Jews as all kinds of inferior or super powerful, both ends of the spectrum, right? Which in itself can be anti-Semitic. And the expression of those attitudes is sometimes, or we might say often, expressed as hatred, okay? Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism. So that means just words and print, right? And cartoons in newspapers and magazines, and also getting beat up or shot at or whatever else may happen. So rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals. So even people who aren't Jewish can be the victim of anti-Semitism and or their property. And it doesn't have to be our person. It could be our synagogue, our JCC, right? The AMIA building in Buenos Aires, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So again, it could be a person's home, a store, a JCC or something similar, or a synagogue. And then I put here in brackets, examples are given. So I want you to know that where it's in blue, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that's a link. So when I send you this slide, you can click on it and it will take you to the actual document, and it has a list of examples. Those examples have white supremacist right-wing examples and left-wing examples, again, whether it's Islamic terror or sort of more of the kind of like boycott, sanctions, and divestment, but like in an explicitly anti-Semitic way. So that's right, also listed, right? It can be on the right and on the left. And again, the goal is, and I want you to know this, right? The goal is for this to be an educational tool, not to be like, you want to know what anti-Semitism is? Go look it up. Here's the definition. Not exactly, right? But many countries, particularly in Europe, have adopted it as a working definition, and some cities and some states in the United States. And the Biden administration has come out saying that it's in favor of adopting this definition. So you may have seen that in the news about 2 weeks ago. And what that means is, minimally, that like the FBI manual on what is a hate crime would include this definition in all those examples, right? Just so when someone reports a crime and it fits this definition, it gets labeled as a hate crime, as anti-Semitism, and not as just another, violent act or a kind of like free speech on the borderline, kind of hateful, but like maybe not, anti-Semitic crime. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have these 4 different ways of thinking about anti-Semitism. One is like particularly about Israel. Does it meet the 3 Ds, right? Any of the 3 Ds, not just all 3, right? Any of those 3. Is it any of this rhetorical or physical, expression of a kind of ideology or actual hatred, right? And then again, is it going to kill us? Or is it just not letting us be Jewish? All of that is kind of a working way of thinking about anti-Semitism. So then the question is like, well, why anti-Semitism in the first place? And we're going to kind of get to be just Jewish for a little bit, and I hope it makes you feel good. And this section maybe not so much make you feel good, but the next section of sources should make you feel good to be Jewish and to like think Jewish and study Jewish. So this is a kind of way of bringing us into like, how did we get here? And I have to tell you, it starts pretty much at the beginning. Some of these sources we've seen before, so I'm going to go a little quickly through the ones we've seen before, like this one, where from the book of Exodus, Pharaoh, a new Pharaoh arose who didn't know Joseph, right? And he said, look, these Israelites are getting to be too many. I'm having trouble annotating. I think I can do it here, right? So we're fertile and prolific. There we go. Okay, and multiplying and increasing. So there are a lot of us in Egypt, or in Goshen, which is an area of Egypt. And what does Pharaoh say? Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let's deal shrewdly with them so they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us. So look, we looked at the idea of being Am B'nai Yisrael, of being like the Israelite people, instead of just being, B'nai Yisrael or the children of Israel. Like now we're a people. That's what we looked at it last time we saw this piece. But now we're being accused of dual loyalty. Right? We're not, we're not even slaves yet. And he's thinking we're going to fight with the enemies of Pharaoh against Pharaoh. There it is. The irony is, by setting up taskmasters and enslaving us, what happens? The more the Israelites were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out. Okay, so there's this idea that no matter what you do to us, we're going to be around. And right, other people, we have in our own text, other people saying other countries are always going to worry that we're going to turn against them, even when we live amongst them. What if we're kind of just on our own? What if we're on the other side of the Jordan River, getting ready to move into Israel. And I don't know what else to say about the setting the stage there, but we're just living in our tents. And by the way, the piece that's here is the first of 3 attempts by the prophet Balaam to curse us. The third attempt, do you know what he says? Anybody? What does Balaam say?
Ma tovu? No.
Exactly. Right. So as we start our services, Ma tovu oleha Yaakov mishkanotecha Yisrael. Right. And it can be Ma tovu or Ma tovu. How beautiful are your tents of Jacob, your dwelling places are Israel. The Midrash tells us it's because we arranged our tents so that everybody had privacy. The opening of my tent and any windows I might have had didn't look out into, so I couldn't like peek into yours. We lived in perfect harmony. 600,000 men of fighting age, and then all the other people around us. So probably 2.5 million people living in tents. We managed that. That's the third curse. Is again a blessing, but really it was intended to be a curse. So what's the first thing that Balaam says? Hen am levadad, right? So and it's the same word, Marla. A chayal boded, a lone soldier, right? We are a lone people. This is a people that dwells apart. We're alone. We're not part of some connection to other peoples in this moment, and not reckoned among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob? Number the dust cloud of Israel. We're so numerous, and yet we don't have our own sort of like belonging among the sort of even the ancient nations of the Amorites and the Midianites and the Moabites, right? We're just this other group, and gazing from above, this is what Balaam says about us. Okay. Okay, what about, we're coming up on Purim, and we've looked at this text a little bit, but I want to kind of like remind us that whereas last time we looked at how it was that, here, Haman saw that Mordecai wouldn't bow low to him, and he's all offended because Jews don't bow to anybody, right? Like the King of Kings is God, so bowing to a king doesn't make much sense. What comes later is what Haman says to Achashverosh. There is a certain people, Am echad mefuraz, mefuzar u mefurad, right? So scattered and dispersed among all the peoples, among other peoples throughout the provinces of the realm. You have to remember, like the way that the Megillah starts off, Achashverosh, his boundaries of his empire extend from the western edge of Turkey all the way to India, from the Black Sea to Ethiopia. It's not clear if it includes the Arabian Peninsula or not. Okay, but like all those places have Jews, and we're scattered among all of them. And what? Oh, our laws are different from those of any people, and we don't obey the king's laws. Right. So again, in Persian perception, we were doing our own thing. We were numerous. We were everywhere. And so Haman tells Achashverosh, it's not in the king's interest to tolerate us. And the Hebrew here is interesting. It's ein shoveh, which means don't equate. Don't like hold them up as the same as Persians, or whatever you want to call any of the other peoples in the Persian Empire at the time. Don't let them be the same. Okay. Two more texts before I'm going to take some questions on all of this. So how do we continue to mark this throughout time in the Passover Haggadah, which we've already looked at, but this piece I'm not sure I showed you before, right? In V'hi she'amda, we say Shelo echad bilvad amad aleinu l'chalotenu, and then we say Ela shebechol dor vador omdim aleinu l'chalotenu. It's true for our ancestors. It's true for us. Not one nation, not just one nation has stood against us to destroy us, but rather in every generation, there's somebody. In every generation, there's somebody. And for what it's worth, right? This past Shabbat, we read Shabbat, the special maftir for Shabbat Zachor, where the Amalekites, as we were traveling to that point where Bilam is going to, bless us, the Amalekites are trailing the Israelites and killing off all of our weakest members. So whoever wasn't keeping up with the caravan, right, the Amalekites were killing, and they're seen to be the embodiment of evil personified. Haman is supposed to be a descendant of Amalek. King Saul in the Haftarah was supposed to wipe out the Amalekites, but lets some of them live and some of the cattle live. So they've perpetually lived throughout all history. People say that Hitler was a descendant of Amalek. There's a question of Saddam Hussein was, he also, particularly when he was launching Scud missiles, right? So we have had this conversation in every generation and associated that, whatever that nation is, with Amalek. So what do we also say, but most of you probably don't, because it's not in every Haggadah anymore. But in the Middle Ages, during the period of the Crusades and the blood libel and all these other ways in which anti-Semitism was like daily life, sad to say, our Haggadah included, when we opened the door for Elijah, this passage where we ask God to pour out God's wrath upon the nations that did not know you and anyone who doesn't call on God's name, by which we mean anyone who hates us. Right? And again, I didn't grow up saying this, but it's in the Haggadah. Sometimes it's in really tiny print. Sometimes it's like, you might want to skip this, but go ahead. And again, a lot of contemporary Haggadot skip it. And since not so many people actually do the stuff after the meal, you might not be familiar with it, but here it is. Questions on what our texts have kind of shown us so far about being a people that lives apart, that's numerous, that lives by its own rules, but also is not necessarily seen as one of the nations of the world, but instead, on our own. Josh.
Well, there were some right-wing Zionists who took a Zionistic kind of thought to what, like that first example of being in Egypt, who said, yes, those countries, we should not be loyal to other countries. It shouldn't be there. We should. Their form of Zionism is all Jews should go to Israel because we don't want to have a split loyalty, because there's no reason to be loyal. These countries, like they said, like your last example, they betrayed us at every turn. They don't deserve our loyalty, and we shouldn't be there. We just, as opposed to Herzl, who at the same time wanted Israel to be a safe haven for Jews, also said that having in Israel would make it safer for some Jews to stay in other countries. Just like a Brit is safer because in London, in Paris, because there's a Britain, and a Parisian is safer in London because there's a France.
Yeah, I mean, it's an open debate as to how to actualize this and what the best version is. And what I'm trying to get everyone to channel here is, right, for much of our history, we weren't so comfortable, right? That whole Jewish American Jew question, like, we're Jews, that's it, that was the end of the story. America has been a singular exception in our 2,000 years of exile from Jerusalem after the Romans, where we kind of have felt like it's okay to actually be a Jewish American, and that's our whole one home, two homes question. So, other questions on where we're at? Okay, I'm gonna take it a little bit further before we switch to like, what do we do with all of this? Okay, so Ross, thank you for identifying yourself as a Jew by choice. This text here basically says, you're the craziest of crazy. And I gotta tell you, we're happy to have you, right? So in the Talmud, the rabbis say, like, what if someone wants to convert to Judaism? You know, and like, yay! Except they're like, in the time of these rabbis, they're like, why would you want to do such a thing? So living in exile, there's no Israel, like life is hard. What do you say to a convert who comes and says, you know, I want to be a Jew? And so we're supposed to ask, what did you see that motivated you to come to convert? And you could stop there, right? You could, you know, question mark, end of story. As some of you know, traditionally we're supposed to turn people away 3 times to see how sincere they are. So well, maybe that's the end of the sentence, but no, I don't want you to read this particular version that way. It's not what motivated you. Nice, okay, come back and talk to me another time. And the second time I'm going to say this, right out of the gate, I'm supposed to say, what did you see? Because by the way, don't you know that the Jewish people at the present time are anguished, suppressed, despised, harassed, and hardships are frequently visited upon them? I'm supposed to get all that out. It's a terrible idea to be Jewish. Being Jewish is hard. Why would you want to do this? Okay, and here's the little known secret. Apart from the 3 times, you know, are you really sincere? I'm going to send you away. If that person says, I know and I'm not worthy, we accept them immediately. Because anyone, and in fact, actually in contemporary conversion process, one of the questions we're supposed to ask once you've finished your year of learning and proven that you're really sincere about this whole thing is, are you really sure you want to be a member of the Jewish people who have been oppressed for so long? I'm supposed to ask you that question one last time before you immerse, right? In the mikveh. Because like, you have to be crazy to want to join us. But you know what? We're all crazy. So, you know, if you're willing, we'll have you. But here it is, it's in the text. This is like 2,400 years old at the youngest, right? It's probably older than that. We've been saying this for a long time. So Jewish perception, self-perception is we are uncomfortable in the world. Life is hard for us. You know, and again, until, and I'll be honest with you, even in America, I would say that this wasn't true until 1968. 2 reasons. One, Israel's successful defense of itself in the 6-Day War. And right around 1968 also is when academic institutions dropped their quotas for Jews and started to kind of just let us in greater numbers. There was still kind of, you know, like, we don't want too many, but it wasn't actually like a fixed number and it was hard to get in. That's when Jews were really given access to the gateways to success in American economic and political life. So really, you know, we're talking about 50 years of feeling comfortable in this country, if that, right? Okay, so now let's talk about like, how do we draw these boundaries for our peoplehood, right? So that was like how we perceive ourselves from the outside, right? Or hear about others seeing us. This is how we deal with it ourselves. Passover Haggadah, the wicked child, they say to us, you know, what does this mean to you? We're supposed to say, well, you're excluding yourself. And I want you to see this. It's in the Hebrew. It's kafar be'ikar. And it's really supposed to be pronounced kofer. It's kind of like, it means to like, I translated it as heretic. Apostate is probably also a good translation, but it's like, in essence, overturning everything. So if the whole story of the Exodus from Egypt is about our solidarity and our understanding that in every generation, you know, we were freed from slavery and this is the counter story to always being oppressed. We just said V'hi she'amda, and now we're saying also God saved us. So someone who excludes themselves from that, you know, whatever that's going on, where we're going to say like, oh, God saved us, like, forget it. You're not part of us. God saved me. And if you had been in Egypt, you would have been left behind. Questions about that before I take us into like a not anti-Semitism space for a minute? Okay. Raise your hand if you have studied Jewish text and gotten into just debate for the sake of debate, or watched the rabbis debate for the sake of debate, and the outcome doesn't matter so much. Not so many hands. Okay, I see a
How
couple
about if
hands.
we just debate for the sake of debating, but not about Jewish texts?
Aha, well, yeah, so right.
We do that all the time.
So Marla, I'm going to get to 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Actually, it's going to be 4 opinions, but we're not there yet. Right now, we're just at like, no, Jews learning to be that way. Okay, so I'm going to give you an experience of that. And I really mean this, like what I was saying Saturday morning about just being in some ways satisfied, but also encouraged and enriched by what it means to be Jewish, because we can do what we're about to do. That should be what we walk away from today with. Not they're out to get us, and not that we have to protect ourselves, but more that we need to have opportunities to like get into an issue that maybe doesn't matter that much, and to see what we can learn from it. And I will help you with the learning. So here's a Mishnah, which is to say this is a text that dates to the year 200. The words in it, meaning the opinions, were expressed before that, but it was compiled into a specific book in the year 200. And this particular discussion is pretty early in the whole book of the Mishnah. It's in Brachot, which is the first tractate. And after arguing about when you say Shema, we're now going to have an argument about how to say it. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of go through this. Beit Shammai say, what do they say? This is typically the school of thought that's very rigid, precise. These would be our constitutional originalists in contemporary parlance. What do they say? They say, in the evening, every person should recline, and in the morning they must stand. Why? Because it says, "Uveshoftecha uvkumecha," when you lie down and when you rise up. The Shema says, lie down. So lie down and say it. It says, when you rise up. Oh, so get up. Don't just sit in bed or, put your feet on the floor. Get up, stand up straight, and say Shema. It's morning time, right? They're literal about the words. Okay, Beit Hillel says, not so much. You say it as you are, because also the text says, as you walk along the way, right? Uvlechtecha baderech, as you literally walk on, typically we mean a road, but Beit Hillel is like, nah, it means like, as you're going about your business. So if it's morning and you're still lying in bed, it's okay to say Shema lying in bed. But if you've already gotten up, you're making breakfast, and it's time for Shema, say it standing. Doesn't matter. At night, you're still pashking around, and there's something good on Netflix, like, so say Shema, standing or sitting. But you don't have to lie down, right? Whereas Beit Shammai is like, no, you gotta lie down. So Beit Hillel has to kind of answer, well, what about the lying down and standing up bit? So the rabbis ask Beit Hillel, why is it when you lie down and when you rise? And they say, only to tell you, at the time when people do that. So it's metaphorical. Like, when do people lie down? At night. When do people rise up? In the morning. So you're supposed to, however you happen to be positioning your body at night, say Shema at night, and however you happen to position your body in the morning, you say it in the morning. The words shofbecha, lie down, mean nighttime, and kuvmecha, when you're rising up, that means morning. Because, by the way, it doesn't say yomam v'layla. It doesn't, like the Shema just doesn't do that. So that's how we should do it. Okay, and you should probably guess that Beit Hillel wins, either because that in debates between these two schools, Hillel usually wins. There are 3 cases where they don't. But also because, yes, if you go to certain classical Reform synagogues, they'll make you stand for Shema. right? But they'll make you stand at night also. If you go to Friday night services at a classical Reform synagogue, you stand for Shema because it's like God's glorious words from the Torah. So like, we're doing Hillel. We're doing like whatever way you're going to do it. We're not doing what you're going to see next. Because Rabbi Tarfon, who, if I have it correctly from Daniel Hartman, is a student of the School of Shammai. He said, one time I was going along the road and I stopped because it was Shema time. It was in the evening. It was time to say Shema. And I lay down, I reclined so I could say Shema in accordance with Beit Shammai. But when I did it, I put myself in danger, right? Because it's dark. I'm going to stop along the road in the dark, lie down on the ground, right? And say Shema, which, for them wasn't just like the one line. It was also Ve'ahavta, the second paragraph, the third paragraph, it's the whole shebang. And he said, so like I put myself in danger from the least team, from brigands, from robbers, from, highwaymen. Imagine Robin Hood and his merry men in Sherwood Forest, right? You wouldn't stop, get out of your wagon, lie down on the ground in the middle of Sherwood Forest in the night. If you were a rich guy, I'm not saying Rabbi Tarfon was so rich, but I'm just saying like, that's a good way of thinking about this. And so what did the sages, what did the rest of the rabbis say to Rabbi Tarfon? You deserved to have your life on the line for transgressing Beit Hillel. I gotta tell you, the rabbis don't usually do that. Normally they're like, okay, you didn't do like Beit Hillel. But in the Mishnah, so codified law, year 200, they're like, you crossed the line by doing like Beit Shammai and putting yourself in danger. You deserved whatever you would have gotten. So let's see what happens when the Talmud comments on that, which is to say, right, again, text compiled in the year 600, so 400 years later, the conversation has continued over time. The rabbis want to know, what are we supposed to do with that story? Normally, and I didn't bring you this story because it's a little bit overused, but it's in your source book if you want it. And Daniel Hartman in his background reading article goes into it a bunch more. Normally we say, Elu ve'elu divarim Elohim chayim. These and these are the words of the ever-living God. That like Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism in particular is pluralistic. You do it your way, I'll do it my way. As long as we're not hurting each other, it's fine. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, like, I don't care how you light your Hanukkah candles. If you want to know the way, do it like Beit Hillel, where we light an additional candle each night. But we're not going to tell Beit Shammai people to stop. Because what did Beit Shammai do for Hanukkah? Lit 8 the first night, 7 the second night, 6 the night after that. They went less and less and less because the oil was running out. They're reenacting what happened in the temple. It's beautiful. No one says you deserve to die for doing that, right? Just that's the minority opinion. You want to know how we should do it? We're going to aspire to more and more light. We're going to bring light to the darkness, right? We're going to do like Beit Hillel. That's the normal way rabbis talk. So this Mishnah seems odd. So now the rabbis are going to figure out what's odd about it and what to do about it. So Rabbi Yecheskel says, one who acted in accordance with Beit Shammai acted appropriately. And if you acted in accordance with Beit Hillel, you're also acting appropriately. That sounds very rabbi-like. Rav Yecheskel, he's got it. It's just like Hanukkah. Who cares how you say Shema, right? Rabbi Tarfon, I'm sorry you were in danger, but it's okay. The sages were wrong. That's what Rav Yecheskel says. Got it? For now? Okay. Next step. Rav Yosef says, one who acts in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai has done nothing and it's worthless. So this is a little bit different. This is like, okay, but it doesn't count. You said Shema by lying down at night. That's not what the Shema is all about. You're supposed to say it as you were. So do it again. Right? Beit Shammai was wrong, but no harm should come to you because of it. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, though, says, no, wait. The Mishnah said very clearly, if you act in accordance with Beit Shammai, you're liable for death, right? Because Rabbi Tarfon said, I went on the road, I recited the Shema, or I stopped, reclined, said Shema, and I endangered myself. And the sages said, you deserve it. You deserve to have your life at risk. 3 categories. 1, they're both equal. 2, they're not equal, but it's okay. Just fix it. Or 3, you put your life on the line, it's your fault, right? You did the wrong thing, and it's outside the norm for whatever reason. You shouldn't have done it. One more version of this kind of like leveling of what it means to do the wrong thing, but now we're talking about sin. Okay. The rabbis tell us in a discussion about sacrifices that we should accept the sacrifices, the offerings from Jewish transgressors or sinners. Foshe Yisrael, okay? Chatati, fashati, I sinned, I transgressed. This is like Yom Kippur, okay? Why should we accept their sacrifice? Because maybe they'll repent. It's good, it's a good idea. Except for 3 cases, actually. No, 3 people we don't want to take their sacrifices because their repentance, I don't know, it's not enough, or we don't care if they repent. They are the apostate. This is the Hebrew there is mumar. I'll talk a little bit about that category in a little bit. The person who pours a wine as a libation to idolatry, right? So, this is what, for those of you who went to the sisterhood program last week on Sunday night, which is why we were on Monday night, right? Like, we don't want someone saying, oh, this is for Zeus. Like, no, wine has to be for God, or, don't say anything. If it's for idolatry, that's a problem. So we're not going to take your sacrifice. Or if you desecrate Shabbat in public, and the in public piece is crucial here, you can do anything you want in private. Shh, I didn't tell you that, right? If you break Shabbat in your home, no one knows. Maybe your family knows, but like, we're not going to do anything to you. We're not going to exclude you in any way. But if you do it in public, forget it. We're not taking your sacrifices anymore. That's what the initial part of the text says. But then the rabbis say, but that contradicts something else that we said, which is that the source for this is, it says of you. It says that we're going to take the sacrifices from you. Meaning, right, but not all of you. Meaning, because if it was from all of us, it would have said from all of you instead of just from you. And so that meant that we were actually excluding just the mumar. So we would accept other categories of sin, but not that. And so how do we reconcile these 2 tensions of like, maybe the idolater and the person who desecrates Shabbat in public is not so bad? Well, the apostate who is somehow a heretic on account of everything in the Torah, they're the person we want to exclude. Someone who's like turned their back on everything Jewish, we're not going to take their sacrifice. There's not room for them to repent. But if it's just like one thing, come on back. We'll take your sacrifice. So I want to give a little bit of color to this, and then use these 2 pieces of just like ancient Jewish practice, or even the Shema, which is contemporary, kind of to say, what can we take from this conversation? Look, if when you get a really good bottle of wine, open it up and let it breathe a little bit, and you take a sip and you're like, oh, Jesus, this is the best stuff I've ever had, right? Should I not let you in synagogue the next day? No, right? Or let's just say every time you drink a particular wine that comes from the Greek guy down the road who is very into Zeus or into Bacchus, because that's the god of, or Dionysus, right? God of wine and drunkenness, like, you're kind of participating in that. But like, if that's your only thing, but you're otherwise a really good Jew, like, fine. Desecrating Shabbat in public. So like, it really kind of depends. Like, are you saying that everything about Shabbat is wrong and Shabbat is just one of many things that's wrong in Judaism? We would have trouble with that. But like, look, if let's say you drove to synagogue on Shabbat and you realized you were out of gas, and you stopped at the gas station and you paid for the gas. Like you did business on Shabbat. What, I'm not going to give you an aliyah? No, right? Like you're trying to get to synagogue, or you want to make sure you can get home from synagogue and be with your family or have guests over at your house, whatever it is. So if it's just like one thing, it's not a big deal. If it's everything, then it is a big deal. And so the question is like, okay, that third child, the wicked child from the Passover Seder, are they saying like, none of this means anything to me? Or are they just saying like, can we get to dinner, please? If they're just saying, can we get to dinner, please? You say like, the Passover story is really important. You need to see yourself as part of it, because if you don't, you would have been left behind. But if they're like, I hate all of this, I don't know why you're making me be here, and like, my best friend is having a lovely Easter dinner, I want to go have some ham and whatever, and you kind of say like, I don't know what's going on with you, we're gonna have a conversation later, right? But like, leave, you're out for now. Does that sort of make sense?
Hartman makes the point that these people act as signposts.
Yes, right. So, and that's the issue, particularly with someone in public, right? Who is witnessing this, and what message are they going to get from it? So, we have to kind of be wary, right, of to what degree we're leaving room for them to come back, right? Or are we being permissible of something that goes against the grain? All right, so I'm going to use what we just studied to actually develop categories that go back to this anti-Semitism thing. Okay, so here we go. I will tell you that Daniel Hartman delineates 3 different categories, and he does this in the first of the 2 units. So I kind of did the second unit first, and now I'm doing the first unit second. He said, right, Rabbi Cheskel said pluralism. Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, it doesn't matter. You do your thing. Both are valuable. Everyone gets to sit at the table, right? Yes, you're good with that? Okay. Let me just scroll up quickly. Sorry, I saw some of you taking notes, but I just want to make sure I get it right. Rav Yosef said, yeah, we're going to tolerate Beit Shammai. Rabbi Tarfon, what he did, it didn't really work. It was inferior, it was wrong. We're supposed to do like Beit Hillel. We're supposed to just say Shema, however we are. But you know what? Like, I respect you as a person. You're still a rabbi. And so I'm going to respect your choice to make mistakes. And particularly because it doesn't pose a threat to me. Like, I'm sorry you felt in danger. That's on you, right? So, like, maybe I won't have you sit at the table with me, but like, you're still out in the room. But Reb Nachman says, no, that's deviant behavior. It's unacceptable. It's intolerable, because being that literal in that way on this particular issue and putting yourself in danger, it's harmful. It's dangerous to all of us. We can't have division. You're not allowed in the room. That's the Brachot Talmud text, okay? And now I want to like make it a little bit more subtle. And this is not exactly in the readings or in the lecture, but I teased it out of Daniel Hartman because he gives these examples. So I want to distinguish between tolerable deviance and intolerable deviance. So that last category of deviance, where we're going to like, I can't have you in the room, we're actually going to say like, maybe I can have you, but I can't have your behavior. So tolerable deviance is where we're going to hate the behavior, but not the person. Rabbi Tarfon, you did that terrible thing. Terrible thing. You should never have put yourself in danger. And by doing that, you set examples to other people to put themselves in danger. Bad, bad, bad boy. Except that, no, actually, you're a good boy. You just made a mistake, right? Or it's like, we don't say thank you, Jesus, for the wine, because then it might be transubstantiation, consubstantiation. I forget the distinction, but either way, we're not drinking God's blood, right? And, right, if it's like Bacchus, like we don't do idolatry anymore. So like, no, it has to be like, if that's the only thing you're doing wrong, Like, let's keep talking, but you got to stop that behavior. I'm going to come back to the last line in a minute. Just bear with me. Versus intolerable deviance, right? I'm going to cancel you. I'm going to shun you. I'm going to excommunicate you. You can't be a part of our community. So that exists in Judaism, and the word mumar is meant to represent that category, particularly for being like a heretic or an apostate about everything. The most famous case is, well, not the most famous, because Spinoza is a famous case, but another famous case is Elisha ben Abuya, who's a rabbi student at the same time period as Rabbi Akiva. He witnesses a child be told by his father, go collect eggs from the bird's nest. So the son obeys his father, one mitzvah, goes to the bird's nest, shoos the mother bird away before taking the egg. Okay, that's another mitzvah. Both of those mitzvot are like one of very, 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 very few where the text of the Torah actually says, if you do this, you'll have a long life. And what happens? The kid falls off the ladder and dies. Elisha ben Abuya says, like, the text said you should have a long life. The kid had a foreshortened life. It's a tragedy. This is illogical, irrational. I'm done with Judaism. Okay? And exactly, Rabbi Beals. So Milton Steinberg brings this story to novelistic life in As a Driven Leaf. But in other passages of the Talmud, the thing is that, like, even though Elisha ben Abuya gets called Acher, he's excommunicated. He's called other, literally. He loses his name, he becomes other. There are other stories in which he's walking with his student Rabbi Meir, and they're discussing all sorts of matters. And Rabbi Meir is trying to, like, leave open the door of repentance for Elisha ben Abuya, who's not taking it. But Elisha ben Abuya is riding a horse, and Meir's like walking alongside him, and they get to the boundary of the Eruv, of the sort of Shabbat boundary where you're allowed to, like, carry things. And Elisha ben Abuya says to Rabbi Meir, you need to stop here because this is the end of the Eruv. Right? He's like he's still living rabbinic Judaism, even though, or he's still thinking it and teaching it, even though he is an apostate in all these other ways. And so the rabbis treat him in some ways as intolerable and in other ways as tolerable in his deviance. And that middle ground, that fuzziness, is where I want us to kind of dwell for a minute. Okay, but to be clear, there is a boundary. So if you look at the bottom line, look, there are plenty of, myself included, if the speed limit is 65, I'm going 72, 73, maybe I'm even going 75. But if I'm going more than 75, I'm a pretty dangerous driver. And let me tell you, when someone passes me on the highway and I'm going 75, I worry that they're being unsafe. Okay, and I'm like, you're crazy, or be more careful. I might yell at the car, or I tell my kids, don't ever do that, right? Because, like, I'm aware of that sort of signpost issue. I say that car's going too fast, right? But, like, I don't really expect that car to do anything other than potentially get a traffic ticket, right? But if I'm driving on the road and I come into close enough contact that I can tell that the driver is driving under the influence or is intoxicated, I don't want them on the road. And I want to make sure that they don't get in the car again until they've learned to, right, be safer in their use of substances or alcohol. Right? And as a society, we draw that line. And someone who is DWI or DUI, they don't just get a ticket. Right? It's a much more serious issue. And so that's an example of how there is a boundary. Okay, so we're running a little slow in terms of covering some information. So I want to apply that to anti-Semitism in terms of how we treat people. And the complicating factor is this issue of right and left and today. So let me briefly tell you a little bit of what is in the materials for the two different units that this week covers. Okay, so Yossi Klein Halevi, I told you a little bit about his story about interviewing the head of the Nazi Party before Skokie, and he's like, you don't worry me. Yossi Klein Halevi then goes into what he does worry about. It's very interesting. What he did worry about wasn't the right wing. It was the left, but it was like all the way to the left. It was communist Russia, the Soviet Union. He was a big part of the Soviet Jewry movement. But one of the things that he came to learn and to notice is that the Soviets were masterful in producing all kinds of, not just the elders of the protocols of Zion, but all sorts of theories of Jewish power and Jews being powerful all over the world and controlling the media and all this sort of, and then turning Israelis into Nazis. Moshe Dayan was Hitler, and a lot of those cartoons are actually in your background reading. And it's worth looking at them to kind of see that imagery. So from the communist left came this idea that Jews are super powerful, and that's the worry about us. Whereas like the Nazi version was, we're weak and useless and, you know, kind of insidious, and the Aryan white, blonde hair, blue-eyed, you know, people of Europe need to rise up and rule the world instead. So you took the right wing and now you have the left wing. And then he saw things kind of swing back to both sides. When we think about the right and the left, it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. So I want to bring you two different texts to kind of highlight that from more recently. And I'm gonna, how do I do this quickly? Okay. The one thing I want to say about this particular text that I'm now showing you on the screen is that if you look at the date, it should hopefully kind of evoke history in a way that like is meaningful. And for me personally, I want you to know, like, brings up a lot of stuff, which is to say that I grew up with all kinds of casual anti-Semitism, but that all changed for me after Pittsburgh. And so the Tree of Life shooting changed how I felt about casual anti-Semitism, because now anti-Semitism was lethal. This is that whole like going back to vilification versus lethal Jew hatred. This piece is written right after the shooting in Pittsburgh, right? And for what it's worth, Beth Shalom has, you know, someone, when we're in the building, someone out the door, right? I think I said this last week. So one of the issues that Alana Newhouse takes out, and I just want to point this out, is like, I haven't had much opportunity to bring you texts by women, but when I can, I will. And I'm glad that Hartman also does this, okay? She was struggling because some people thought that the issue with this attack was gun control. And yes, gun control plays a role, right? But like what this man was doing was very clearly expressing right-wing, white supremacist, anti-Semitic hatred, because this synagogue had been working with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, to bring refugees, right? And typically refugees from Muslim countries to America to help them resettle, and not for nothing, right? Like many of you know that one of the refugee families who's come to Delaware, they're Afghani, and the father in the family, he was fleeing the Taliban because he translated for the American Armed Forces, right? If America can't welcome in someone who helped us abroad, I don't know who we should let in, right? And I'm just saying, like, you know, he did all the right paperwork, like nothing about illegal. I'm talking about, right, appropriate. So, you know, this guy didn't want any more of that, and he chose to attack a synagogue on Shabbat and during services, and Alana Newhouse is saying, like, we need to make sure that we're calling out the anti-Semitism and what happened. Normally, she says, like, the issue about prejudice in America is about race, gender, and sexual orientation. And Jews have been trying to be helpful on the left because we know what it's like to be persecuted and oppressed and seen as other. And so if someone's being seen as other or persecuted or oppressed because of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, we feel that whole, like, you know, love the stranger as because you were strangers in Egypt, that whole kind of thing we talked about last time. We want to help out. But to see this as only an issue of that and to the exclusion of our Jewishness is to miss a big deal. And likewise, she said, right, for people on the right who consort with anti-Semitism but maybe they don't mean it, like, and they should be held responsible, that doesn't work either. So she's saying, like, for those of you on the left who think that, like, you know, we can't call this anti-Semitism when it clearly was, that's the problem. And for those of you on the right who are going to excuse, right, the actions of this lone wolf without taking any sort of ownership of anti-Semitic tropes that you've been using, like, that's also a mistake. And Deborah Lipstadt, who's one of the foremost scholars on anti-Semitism, wrote much more recently that she sees Jew hatred today as different. And why is it particularly alarming? Because usually it's either from the right or the left, and now it's coming in 3 sides at the same time. I'll be honest, I read the whole article that this came from, and it's not clear what the 3rd side is, but I'll tell you what I think it is. So first of all, it's at the same time, the right and the left. So it's harder to be a Jew right now than it's been in, you know, most of history. The 3rd side is us calling each other names. Right? The very fact that, like, somebody does something anti-Semitic on the right and the left says boo, 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 and someone on the left does something anti-Semitic and the right says boo, 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 and, like, I'm a Jew and maybe I'm on the left, maybe on the right, and you're throwing me in with the person who did the anti-Semitic thing and not letting me just be a Jew. It's like a 3rd column to what anti-Semitism is doing to divide us and to cause hatred. And she goes on to say that Jews have politicized the fight against the torrent of hatred. And what we need to do is see it on our own side, right, in addition to seeing it on the other, right, and stop calling each other names. Which takes us back to this. Could we, right, here's the question mark version, right? Can we say this? Can we say, like, intolerable deviance? Like, Trump, you said some bad things, right? But you yourself didn't march on the Capitol. I'm making that up. Like, that's not a real example. I mean, it is an example, but I don't mean it as a genuine, like, I didn't say it, okay? Right? Because there were clearly people wearing, like, all kinds of paraphernalia at the insurrection, saying that, you know, Camp Auschwitz and the Holocaust didn't do enough. World War II wasn't enough to get rid of us. And Ilhan Omar, you know, it's not just 1 tweet or 2 tweets. It's that, like, even after she tweets, it's kind of, like, not so clear that she got the message. But do we really want, is it helpful to us in any way to say that either of them is an anti-Semite, right? Are we better off leaving the question mark there instead of, you know, definitively putting them in the intolerable deviance category? That's a lot to think about. So I don't want to open up a whole Pandora's box because we've been going already for our whole time. And so I'm going to offer you the following things and then just take, you know, instead of, like, general questions, I'll say, like, maybe write down what you're thinking or wondering, right? And we'll start next week with it. But if you have a question, if you want clarification, let's do that. To complicate things further, I share with you this link here. It's a pastoral letter to Shir Tikva, which is a Reform congregation, not just in Minnesota, right, but in Ilhan Omar's district, where all the rabbis got together and wrote a piece about, like, what it means to call her out on anti-Semitic tropes, but to still work with her because she's their representative and because she's actually willing to be respectful in the room and at the same time, right, to understand that some of the actions and things that President Trump has done or said, right, have made the atmosphere equally uncomfortable, and that their goal as a community is to be a community that's dedicated to its values. If you didn't follow the distinctions that I was drawing between pluralism, tolerance, and deviance, it's in the source book. Danielle Hartman wrote a kind of a whole book on boundaries, and this is an excerpt from it. I encourage you to look at those cartoons from the Soviet era. And if you want more on that IRA working definition, in addition to the link back, on the slide that had the actual definition, there was a podcast just this past week where Yehuda Kurtzer from the Hartman Institute interviews one of the diplomats who was involved in writing it, and she talks about its application and what does it mean for Congress to vote to condemn Ilhan Omar's remarks, not as anti-Semitic, but as part of bigotry, and to say bigotry doesn't belong in Congress. And how when Jewish Congress people were together for a class and sitting around with Yehuda Kurtzer, one of them says, "I've never felt less comfortable to be a Jew than now." And another Jewish Congress person says to that person, like, "Look where you are. You're a congressperson. You're a Jew representing like a whole district in the United States Congress. It couldn't get any better." And we have to hold these truths at the same time, right? And so the one thing I want to kind of put out to you, and again, then I'll take questions and we'll bracket the rest for next week, is that like you all just spent the last hour and 35 minutes studying Jewish texts and talking about Jewish identity, and nothing could be more beautiful. And even though we were talking about something rather painful, and many of you may have actually experienced anti-Semitism or had to endure it, and maybe it's still alive for you in many ways, right? Causing fear, makes me afraid. We can study text, and we can root ourselves in our values, and we can see that maybe, right, there are categories in which we could still sit in the same room, not only with each other because we're all Jews, right, but even with people who maybe have crossed a line that makes us uncomfortable, but didn't necessarily threaten our lives. And if that is something of a hard message to take in, then I would just ask you to think about during Purim, every time the name Haman comes up and we try to make noise and make it go away, and the kids are having a blast and they don't really care who Haman was, they just know they get to go boo and make noise, right? That we've turned, like, again, the embodiment, at least in his era, of Jew hatred into a game. And if we can just feel the power of being able to be together and of being rooted in our values and being able to have a conversation, again, sometimes filled with disagreement, then we can live a life filled with joy, even while we remember that there are times when we need to be rightfully afraid, and we have to take action just like Esther did. So again, any clarifying questions before we kind of sign off and pick up next week? I promise we'll open with just free flowing discussion, and I'll make room for it. Yes, the Rabbi.
For next week, can you maybe talk a little bit about the authorities who create the boundaries? I put it in the chat because I think as conservative Jews, it resonates differently with us than it might to Orthodox or Reform, or like when you were upset about the speeder, there's nothing you could do about it. I mean, you can't do a citizen's arrest as much as you'd like to. I sometimes want to like have little buttons in my car that I could launch missiles, but it's only in my little fiction, but we're powerless sometimes to enforce those boundaries. I'll leave it there, but I think it's a question worth asking.
Definitely. And just for those of you who are really interested in that question, again, I recommend that podcast on the IRA definition, because again, the diplomat talks a little bit about how it's meant to be educational and not legal. And so what does it mean for us to advocate for ourselves in an educational way with law enforcement, right? So to engage authority in, right, helping us work out some of those boundaries. Other questions for clarification? I really, I hope everyone has a lovely Purim, right? Oh, Marla, yes.
I just want to say, are we going to revisit this left-right thing? Because I feel it very acutely. Ross and I must have a story once a day with each other about a friend who accused us of how could you, and we feel that way about our friends. We don't say that, but
yes, because next week, what's the topic? Dual loyalty and identity politics, right? So like, do you have to pick a side? Like, and why are we so interested in picking sides? And right, like, and
maybe if we had a way of talking about it, because part of the problem I have is I don't know how to respond. I don't know how to help my friends. I don't know how to articulate. So that would be helpful. And this was helpful, this discussion tonight of the different types of anti-Semitism, but it's such an acute issue for, I think, many of us right now.
No, absolutely. And again, like, you know, I know that I shared this sort of like area of possibility. It stinks to be living on the line between these two things. It's much better to live in a world where we're comparing tolerance and pluralism. And the Jewish world used to live over here, but now we're living in this category of deviance. And again, the question is, what can we do about it? I'll be honest and say, like, I haven't fully prepared next week's material, so I don't know how well it'll address it, but I promise to like carve out time to make sure we do. If the text doesn't, and if the text does, then I'm gonna like front load the text and then, you know, leave a lot of space for the conversation.
I just want to add, I'm as intolerant as other people at times. So I want to admit that that's part of the problem. When you say about pluralism, yes, and tolerance, but I'm finding that I'm not always so that way either.
Right. And again, so the word hate here and hating someone's behavior, it's okay, right? As long as you're distinguishing and trying to make room for the person. And like, what does it mean if you are like losing respect for them? So we're gonna have to revisit that. Other sort of questions in advance of following in this conversation next week? I'm sorry, it's a bit of a cliffhanger.
I would recommend Hartman's book. It's not easy reading, but I would recommend it.
The one, Fred, he has a few. Which one?
We consider the possibility of having an extra session at the end just to discuss everything, like sort of like a, you know, doing it the Sunday immediately after might be too close to Pesach, but just a general idea of without new material, just kind of a review / discussion.
I'm certainly open, and the 21st is not like the day before Pesach, so it's a definite maybe.
Jeremy, I just want to thank you for, you know, making this a very engaging and interesting conversation. It's just great to talk Jewish for an hour and a half and listen Jewish for an hour and a half, and Israel and everything. And your demeanor is so nice.
So,
thank you.
Well, thank you. And again, hold on to that, whatever that is, like for all of you. That's what's going to keep us going. And may it be your simcha and during Adar, this Hebrew month that leads to Purim, because God knows Pesach is coming soon enough.
Right. And just as an aside, I want to say your Devar, the Shabbat, was one of the best I've heard in a long time.
Thank you for that too.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Hag Sameach.
Hag Sameach.
Purim Sameach.